dive into the specifics of how capitalism and democracy work in a few very successful capitalist democracies. As you know, our main question, how much does the state intervene in the economy, is not a clear-cut all-or-nothing issue. It is not the case that there are pure capitalist free market countries versus pure communist command economy models. Today we are going to see a few very different ways that capitalism can successfully flourish alongside democracy. Specifically, we're going to think about how the state deals with bad outcomes in the market, or market failures. We will also think about how to balance free markets with democracy, as in some ways they logically contradict one another. Finally, we'll consider how the state encourages prosperity and a high quality of life for its citizens. We are not comparing objectively successful and unsuccessful capitalistic systems. The states we're going to examine today each have very different interactions with the market, but they are each some of the strongest free market economies and democracies in the world. So we're looking here at a few different ways the state can quite effectively interact with the market. This is not to say that they are perfect, they each have enormous problems. Still, making an argument that one system is better than another requires a lot of careful analysis, and sweeping generalizations will tend to fall short. A lot of what we're dealing with today is the way that states deal with market failures. You will remember that a market failure is when the free market provides some sort of bad outcome. These failures can be both objective and subjective. Sometimes a market failure is an objective fact, meaning that the market as it functions on its own produces some inefficient outcome. A prime example of this is the development of a monopoly in the free market, which will then undermine the efficient functioning of the market by setting prices and blocking competition. Negative externalities are another example. An externality in the economic sense is an unintended consequence, something that is not necessarily included in the price. Because it is not included in the sticker price, the free market ignores it, but it may be something that society as a whole will not tolerate, like a chemical company dumping toxic waste in the manner that contaminates drinking water. Going about correcting these failures is typically what we would consider the beneficial, non-controversial roles of the state interacting with the market. As we'll see, a lot of the real differences among our cases today happen in terms of subjective market failures. A market failure is a flexible term, and it can mean not only objective, suboptimal performance, but performance that is efficient from the perspective of the market, but produces an undesirable outcome. The key example here is massive inequality, poverty, hunger, and other forms of human suffering that can be a byproduct of the wealth produced for others. This is tricky because each individual will have his own subjective view of how much inequality and suffering is tolerable, and how much the state should do, if anything at all, to alleviate these more subjective market failures. In other words, some things are market failures for one person, and the market working perfectly well for another. Finally, one last thing to keep in mind is how states deal with the inherent tension between capitalism and democracy. Think of it this way. Capitalism will always produce some inequality. That is, there will be a gap between the richest and poorest members of a country. This gap can be quite dramatic in some circumstances. Moreover, the poor tend to vastly outnumber the rich. As democracy is a system that tends to grant the wishes of the majority, how is it that democracy and capitalism can even exist together? Why don't the poor just vote it out of existence? Finally, a high-quality democracy is predicated on the idea that all people have an equal voice in their government. Another thing to keep in mind is the extent to which these different systems affect political equality by affecting economic inequality. Economic inequality is a reality for the free market, and indeed it is one of the things that makes it function by providing the incentives for people to work hard. However, if money equals political access, this can be an enormous barrier for the efficient functioning of democracy. So now we know what we're talking about. Let's dive into the specifics of these models. We'll start with a model that we are all probably most familiar with, the United States. The U.S. is somewhat confusingly called the regulatory state, which makes it sound like a highly restrictive state. On the contrary, the U.S. is a very free market state and involves some of the lowest state intervention in the economy in the world. It is called the regulatory state because instead of trying to steer the market in a certain direction, the U.S. government tends to play a backseat role, just providing the regulations necessary for the market to function. The general idea is to let the market determine which businesses and industries flourish and which fail. Of course, the U.S. government still does a lot of things vis-a-vis the market. It sets interest rates and controls the money supply, imposes trade barriers, gives subsidies and tax breaks to some industry, and levies extra taxes on others to try and encourage or discourage certain behaviors, and it oversees a vast network of regulations to ensure that business in the U.S. is stable and safe. Most of these roles are what we would call the necessary and the beneficial roles of state interaction with the market. In terms of politically generated rules, those interactions with the market that the state takes on as a result of political pressure from groups within the state, the U.S. tends toward the leaner side. In fact, it is a very unique system when compared to other similarly wealthy democracies, which tend to have a much larger public sector, meaning their government takes more in taxes and doles out more in various social programs. The U.S. does do certain things that aren't necessary for the market's functioning, such as legislate things like workers' rights, child labor laws, and the provisions for the very poor. In terms of social policy, by most accounts, the U.S. has much lower social spending than comparable wealthy democracies. With the exception of Social Security, which is a social insurance program that all must contribute to and can benefit from, most U.S. social assistance takes the form of means testing. People must show that they are at a certain level of need, and they can typically receive benefits only for a finite period. This aid tends to be attached to a number of other factors. Thus, the U.S. government does not do much to provide equality of outcome or redistribute wealth. Instead, it aims at helping the very needy in society to get out of their unfortunate situations in an attempt to increase equality of opportunity. While the U.S. has relatively lower taxes on income as well as expenditures on social policy, it does have another type of social policy that some consider a form of welfare. A political scientist named Christopher Howard argues that the U.S. actually has a hidden welfare state when you take tax incentives into account. Tax incentives are tax baits or rebates that help certain groups or industries or encourage certain behaviors. Thus, you get a tax break for interest on your mortgage or your student loan. You can get a tax benefit or rebate for being a first-time home buyer or for engaging in environmentally beneficial behaviors, such as driving a green car or installing solar panels. Many industries benefit from great tax breaks. On their face, these tax incentives look very different from other forms of social policy, but if you think about it, they do pretty much the same thing. They are the government giving more or less money to certain people. Howard argues that when we take these tax incentives into account, the American welfare system is actually a little bit bigger than the average. As an aside, he's a critic of this form of social policy and argues that instead of helping those who need it the most, the U.S. system of tax incentives tends to actually help those of the upper middle and upper classes. So to recap, the American regulatory state has a more hands-off, laissez-faire approach to the market. The key aim is to allow the market to flourish on its own and to let competition determine which firms and individuals succeed and which fail. The state's intervention is targeted mainly at ensuring that the business environment is stable and good for investment, and then fighting some obvious negative externalities to ensure consumer safety. Now let's look at a very different system, the social democratic model. Here, we'll use the case of Germany, which some also call the Christian democratic model, as well as the case of Sweden, which is the paradigmatic example of a welfare state. You might hear these countries referred to as European socialists. That's not exactly right, but it does have a basis in truth, as these systems are an attempt at a middle way between capitalism and socialism. That is to say, these states attempt to reap the benefits and efficiency of capitalist competition while striving for some of the equality of socialism. The general idea of social democracy is to allow the free market to work its magic. Thus, competition among firms is encouraged and the market decides which firms and individuals get ahead and which go bust. However, there is a much greater emphasis on combating the inequality produced by the free market. These states use social policy much more than the regulatory state to smooth out the business cycle and the inequality produced by capitalism. Thus, we can say that these states spend more on the politically generated rules of the market, and the working class tends to be much more well-positioned to make decisions about the economy. In Germany, this practice is actually enshrined in the laws of the state. Mid to large companies must abide by co-determination, or Mitbestimmung. This means that companies are required to have representatives from the workers, usually via labor unions, sit on their actual boards. Thus, workers have a very strong leadership position in the company and they help make a lot of the main decisions. Because of this cooperation, workers get pretty cushy benefits, but employers actually wind up with workers who are more invested in the company. Sweden provides such extensive social policy because of extremely powerful labor unions. The party supported by these unions, the Social Democratic Party, has been in power for the majority of the time since World War II. It has put in place social policies featuring universal entitlement so that everyone in society enjoys benefits such as free healthcare and education and a guaranteed basic level of sustenance. Thus, social policy in these states is quite extensive, and levels of taxation and social spending are much higher than in the U.S. For instance, whereas in the US, less than a third of GDP goes through the state, in Sweden that proportion is greater than half. These welfare states explicitly aim at using social policy to provide much greater equality of opportunity as well as equality of outcome. Sweden relies mostly on universal entitlements. This is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Everyone in the state gets the same benefits. Thus, the economic floor in Sweden is not as low as in many other states because even the poorest have a sufficient income to live off of, get state-provided medical care, and free higher education. Germany relies a lot on social insurance programs like our Social Security program in the US. Social insurance programs mean that everyone must pay into the pot, but that everyone is then eligible to receive benefits. Germany does have some universal entitlements, however. Indeed, you might be jealous to learn that if you are brainy enough to get into a university in Sweden or in Germany, not only do you get out of paying tuition, but the state provides you with a living stipend. Sounds nice, right? Of course, once you get out of university and get your job, you do end up paying much higher taxes. There's always a catch. With higher taxes, you might suspect these countries have a hard time remaining competitive. Well, high taxes certainly have many disadvantages, mainly that you have to pay them, but income tax rates and the size of the public sector don't appear to be causally connected to economic prosperity, according to most analysts. As a case in point, these are two of the most successful capitalistic systems in the world today. Like every system, they have their flaws, but they tend to perform pretty well. Their trick is that they develop a highly skilled workforce. Think of it this way. You lose your job. In Germany, you still have health care and you still get a pretty decent income, and if you work hard enough, you can probably get into some retraining vocational program. You can afford to complete that program because you still have your basic needs met, even if life isn't too cushy. Thus, these two states have extremely skilled labor forces and have become some of the biggest exporting powers in the world today. Moreover, they aren't exporting cheap things. Think of the German brands you know, things like Mercedes and BMW, things that produce a huge markup. Now let's turn to our third broad type of capitalist state, the developmental state in Japan. The basic idea here is state-led development. Whereas in the regulatory and social democratic models, the state typically lets the market decide where investment flows, in the developmental state, the government plays an active role in encouraging the growth of certain industries and businesses by investing in them. Thus, the state picks and chooses, and it actually tries to avoid a lot of the harsh competition that is the benchmark of capitalist systems in other states. The logic behind this is to develop industries that produce positive externalities. You'll recall that a negative externality is a bad side effect of some economic activity that is not included in the price. A positive externality is just like that, but obviously, it's a positive side effect. Thus, electronics and cars and things that involve a lot of technology and can be readily exported are encouraged by the Japanese state through investment. This investment works through what is called the keiretsu system. Here, businesses are organized into conglomerates, which are groups of related firms that surround a bank. So Sony is part of a conglomerate, and all of the companies that make all the little bits that go into Sony products and all of the companies that deal with the selling and distribution of Sony are all part of that same conglomerate. They all use the same bank, a special bank dedicated to the Sony conglomerate, and these firms, as well as the bank, overlap a lot in terms of ownership. Thus, they aren't really competing with one another, they work together and with the bank, all making decisions rather collectively. This sort of cooperation is actually illegal in the US and many other states. All of these conglomerates are organized around the Japanese central bank. That's how the state is able to partly determine which industries and companies get ahead. They have the central bank give great loan deals, often at a loss of profit, to the conglomerate's bank. The system allows for the state to target specific goals, generally targeting export industries, but it does come at the cost of making it really hard for new companies to enter, and thus arguably can stymie innovation and flexibility. What about social policy? Well, the Japanese model is more like the US model here, in that the state actually doesn't have very extensive social provision policies. The basic idea is to provide by encouraging economic growth. However, Japanese private firms tend to provide a lot more security and benefits than their American counterparts. Companies tend to really take care of their employees as they are seen as lifetime investments. Many firms provide lifetime employment, and in lean times do not fire people, but retrain them instead. Workers are more loyal, and are unlikely to take their new skills to another company because a lot of the pay is based upon seniority within one company. Thus, you get more money by staying with the same company and working your way up within it than you do by putting yourself out on the market and waiting for a better offer to come along. So there are three very different ways that capitalism can thrive with democracy. Here's a quick recap. Basically, you can see that in a regulatory state, the market determines investment targets and the distribution of wealth. In the social democracy model, the market still determines investment, but the state intervenes much more to redistribute wealth. Finally, in the developmental state, the distribution of wealth and provision of many social policies is left to the private sector, but the state actually directs investment. Let's conclude with a few statistics to see what difference these models make. So first, let's take a look at levels of poverty and levels of equality within society. As you might expect, because of the explicit focus on leveling out inequality, social democracies tend to have much lower poverty rates and much more equal distribution of wealth. So here is poverty calculated as being people living below 50% of the median income. And as you can see, the United States and Japan have relatively much higher levels of people living below this level than Germany or Sweden. Here's the distribution of wealth among quintiles in the United States. Wealth meaning not just income, but also savings, investments, property ownership, and the amount of capital that you own. And as you can see, the top 20% owns 85% of the wealth in the United States. The second top 20%, 11%, the middle 20%, 4%, and the bottom 40% barely showing up. Sweden has much more equality here. The top 20% owns 35% as opposed to 85%, and the other quintiles actually own a big chunk of the wealth in the state. This does come at a cost, though. If you look at how much the government spends in terms of the percentage of GDP, you can see that it's much higher in Germany and Sweden. You can also see that tax revenues in Germany and Sweden are much higher than the United States and Japan. So nothing comes for free. The equality that the social market buys comes at the cost of much higher taxes. Here's one interesting thing about America, though, is that most people, when asked by Pew recently, in America, do think that they can reach the American dream. So there's this idea of social mobility, that you can move your way up. If you look, however, at the chart to the right, the United States actually has a relatively low social mobility. So this shows the probability that you will stay in the same income group as your parents. So you see the United Kingdom at 0.5, that means there's a 50% chance that you will be in the same income group as your parents. So if you start out rich, you'll remain rich, and if you start out poor, you'll remain poor. The United States is right behind it at 47%. But you can actually see that Germany and Sweden, they're not the lowest. So there are many, many other possible outcomes and statistics that we can look at, and it gets pretty complicated. And it's really not a question of drawing a single line. It's actually drawing tons of different kinds of lines, and you have to deal with the political system, the society's culture, and a lot of specific outcomes. So, which is better? Well, as I just alluded to, there's really no clear answer to that. Arguably, any of these is better, or none of them is better. This is an enormous balancing act. Most of the time it depends on so many factors that it's really hard to pin down exactly what the results of any given policy will be. In some rare occasions, it does seem like we can isolate methods of market-state interactions that result in objectively better or worse outcomes. A lot of the time, however, it will come down to subjective evaluations about what kind of society is better or worse, meaning that there is no universal right or wrong, but our own individual and collective opinions about what we value as people and societies. Many see the hands-off nature of the U.S. system as largely to blame for the shenanigans that caused the financial calamity in 2008, while social democracy is facing huge budget problems, and the Japanese state has seen stagnant growth for 2 decades following its remarkable breakthrough. The line between the state and the market is a bit like a Goldilocks problem. You'll remember that she was always complaining that things were too hot or too cold, too big or too small, and always holding out for something that was just right. This is kind of like what we see with state involvement with the market. Too much state involvement strangles the free market, blocks the ability of the law of supply and demand to work its magic, and leads to economic problems. Too little means that the state has low capacity, and the market goes unregulated and can even collapse upon itself. So again, we see that there are trade-offs, and there is no clear right or wrong, an emerging theme for our class. Thank you so much for your attention. Good luck with the rest of the work.